If you carry type O positive blood, you are not just walking around with a letter and a symbol printed on a plastic card in your wallet. You are carrying a secret written in a language older than every book, every religion, and every civilization that has ever risen and fallen on this planet. For decades, doctors treated your blood type as nothing more than a logistical detail, a simple compatibility code used music to keep hospital transfusions from going catastrophically wrong. But the moment scientists finally got close enough to read the raw genetic script hidden underneath that single letter, they didn't just find a compatibility code, they found a confession. A confession about where your ancestors came from, what they were running from, and what price they secretly paid so that you could exist today. And here is the uncomfortable part. That price never actually went away. It is still sitting quietly inside your bloodstream, right now, shaping your risks, your vulnerabilities, and your future in ways that most people carrying this blood type have absolutely no idea about. Music. To understand the dark secret hiding inside type O positive blood, we first have to go back to the moment scientists got the entire story catastrophically wrong. The year was 1901. Music. An Austrian physician named Karl Landsteiner was hunched over a microscope in Vienna, trying to solve a mystery that was quietly killing patients all across Europe. At the time, blood transfusions were essentially a coin flip. Sometimes a dying patient would receive donated blood and miraculously recover. Other times, music the exact same. Procedure would kill them within minutes, their blood violently clotting inside their own veins. Nobody understood why. Landsteiner began mixing blood samples from different people in glass dishes, watching closely to see what happened. Some combinations stayed calm, smooth, and liquid. Other combinations reacted instantly, clumping together into thick, deadly clots right before his eyes. Music. That single observation cracked open one of the greatest medical mysteries in human history. He had just discovered the 4 human blood groups, A, B, AB, and O. It would eventually earn him a Nobel Prize. But almost immediately, something went wrong. Not with the science itself, but with the assumptions European researchers built on top of it. They looked around at their own populations, saw type A blood everywhere they turned, and quietly decided that type A must be the original ancestral form of human blood. Type O, in their eyes, looked like a strange later mutation, a simplified, almost primitive version of something more sophisticated. It was a small, arrogant assumption, and it was completely, devastatingly wrong. Music. Because when researchers finally had the tools to look past the surface and directly into the genome itself, they discovered a hidden gene sitting on chromosome 9, quietly acting like a factory switch, deciding whether or not your red blood cells would be built with extra molecular decorations on their surface. And when they traced that switch backward through deep time, the story that emerged was the exact opposite of what everyone had assumed. Type O wasn't the mutation. Type O was the original. It was the ancient baseline, the raw foundation that every other blood type was eventually built on top of. Type A and Type B weren't older. They were the newcomers. And that single reversal is where the darkness of this story truly begins. Because if type O positive blood really is the oldest, most primitive genetic blueprint still circulating through human bodies today, that raises an uncomfortable question. Music. Why did it survive at all? Evolution is not sentimental. It does not preserve old things simply because they are old. It only keeps traits that win brutal, silent wars. And the survival of type O blood was never a peaceful inheritance. It was the scar tissue left behind by one of the deadliest hidden conflicts our species has ever endured. When geneticists began mapping this ancient blood signature across the entire globe, the numbers were staggering. In parts of Europe, type A dominated. In regions of northern India, type B climbed to extraordinary levels. But when researchers finally tested isolated indigenous populations in the Americas, populations that had been genetically sealed off from the rest of humanity for tens of thousands of years, they found something almost impossible. Type O blood didn't just dominate. In some communities, it approached nearly 100% of the entire population. Not most people. Music? Nearly everyone. In genetics, that kind of extreme concentration has a name. It is called a founder effect, and it tells scientists something very specific. It means the original small band of explorers who first crossed into this continent were carrying an overwhelming amount of type O blood. And every single person alive in those communities today is a direct genetic echo of that one small founding group. So where did those original explorers actually come from? Every strand of modern evidence, ancient skeletal remains, mitochondrial DNA, and deep genomic mapping points to the exact same answer. Music. They walked out of Asia. They crossed a frozen wind-battered land bridge that once physically connected Siberia to Alaska, and they carried their type O blood with them into a brand new hemisphere. Even today, Asia remains an enormous reservoir of this ancient genetic signature? In the Philippines, roughly 45% of the population still carries type O blood. In Vietnam, the number sits close to 42%. And when researchers examine the tiny genetic markers that surround the type O gene in modern populations scattered across the entire planet, those markers all trace backward through thousands of generations into the deep, humid, disease-ridden landscapes of ancient Asia. But here's where the story stops being simply fascinating and starts becoming genuinely dark. Because that ancient Asian homeland was not some peaceful genetic Eden. Music. It was a battlefield. And the survivors who eventually spread type O blood across the entire planet did not win that battle because they were strong or fast or intelligent. They won it because of something happening on a microscopic level, deep inside their own blood, completely outside their control or awareness. Throughout almost all of human history, the deadliest force on Earth was never war, and it was never predators. It was invisible. It was disease. Plagues, parasites, and bacteria killed far more human beings than any weapon ever forged. And your blood type, right now, sitting inside your veins, is the literal battlefield where those invisible wars were fought generation after generation for tens of thousands of years. Let's start with malaria, because it is the clearest example of exactly how brutal this trait actually was. Music. For hundreds of thousands of years, malaria has hunted humanity relentlessly across the tropical regions of the world. When the malaria parasite invades the human bloodstream, it specifically targets red blood cells, hijacking them and using them as breeding grounds. But type O cells are structurally different from other blood types. They lack the extra molecular decorations found on type A and type B cells, which means the surface of a type O red blood cell is essentially smooth. Clinical researchers have observed that when malaria infects type O blood, the infected cells fail to clump together and stick to blow. Odd vessel walls the way they do in other blood types. The dangerous traffic jam that malaria depends on to cause severe, often fatal complications simply doesn't happen as easily. This gave ancient type O carriers a real measurable survival advantage in malaria-heavy regions. They got sick less severely, they lived long enough to have children, and their children inherited that same advantage. But before you start thinking of type O as some kind of biological superpower, understand this. Nature never gives a gift without demanding a payment. And the payment for this malaria resistance turned out to be devastating in an entirely different way. Music. This is the part of the story that most people never hear. The same smooth, simplified cellular structure that helped ancient type O carriers slip past malaria left the front door of their bodies wide open for other killers. Take cholera. In regions like the Ganges Delta, where cholera has terrorized populations for centuries, clinical data from severe outbreaks reveals something chilling. The cholera toxin binds far more efficiently to the cells of people with type O blood. When a cholera epidemic sweeps through a community, people carrying type O blood suffer catastrophic, life-threatening dehydration at significantly higher rates than people with other blood types. Entire type O bloodlines were quietly erased in regions where cholera repeatedly struck, which is exactly why type O blood is measurably rarer today in parts of India with a long, brutal history of cholera outbreaks. The land itself, through disease, edited the genetic makeup of the people living on it. Music. And cholera is only the beginning. If you carry type O blood, clinical research has repeatedly linked your blood type to a significantly higher lifetime risk of developing stomach ulcers. The reason traces back to a corkscrew-shaped bacterium called Helicobacter pylori. This bacterium thrives inside the biological environment created by type O stomach linings, burrowing in and triggering chronic inflammation that, left untreated, can eventually spiral into severe gastric disease. In East Asian populations today, researchers continue closely monitoring the disturbing relationship between type O blood, this specific bacterium, and elevated rates of gastric illness, including, in some long-term studies, an increased association with certain forms of stomach cancer. Music. And then there's a darker pattern still, one that has only recently started receiving serious scientific attention. Multiple large-scale population studies conducted in the last 2 decades have found a consistent, unsettling correlation. People with type O blood appear to face a measurably higher risk of dying from severe traumatic injury and uncontrolled bleeding compared to people with other blood types. Researchers believe this connects directly back to blood clotting. Type O blood carries naturally lower levels of a critical clotting protein called von Willebrand factor. Under normal, everyday circumstances, this is actually a hidden benefit, giving type O carriers a lower lifetime risk of dangerous blood clots, deep vein thrombosis, and certain cardiovascular blockages. But flip the situation into a genuine emergency, a serious car accident. In it, A major surgery, a severe hemorrhage, and that same thin, fast-flowing blood becomes a liability instead of an asset. It clots more slowly. It struggles to seal off catastrophic bleeding. In trauma wards around the world, this single fact has become an uncomfortable, quietly discussed reality among emergency physicians. The same ancient advantage that helped your ancestors survive, malaria outbreaks, may now be working against you in a modern emergency room. 10,000 years and thousands of miles removed from the environment it originally evolved to protect you against. Even something as small and seemingly harmless as a mosquito bite reveals this pattern. Controlled clinical studies, where volunteers placed their bare arms into enclosures full of hungry mosquitoes, found that the insects landed on and bit type O carriers, almost twice as often as they bit type A carriers. Something chemical, something written directly into your skin and your BL. OD signals to mosquitoes that you are the preferred meal. In regions where mosquitoes carry serious diseases beyond malaria, dengue fever, yellow fever, and other viral threats, that single biological quirk quietly increases your overall exposure risk year after year, without you ever realizing exactly why you always seem to be the one getting bitten at every outdoor gathering. Music. But there's another layer to this story that almost never gets discussed, and it has nothing to do with disease at all. It has to do with the letter that quietly rides alongside the word positive on your medical chart. Most people assume the plus sign is just a minor footnote, an afterthought bolted onto the real story of A, B, and O. It is not. The Rh factor, the actual protein that determines a completely separate genetic system layered on top of your blood type, and it carries its own hidden, sometimes tragic history. Music. For a woman who is Rh negative carrying a child who is Rh positive, her immune system can, under certain circumstances, begin quietly treating her own unborn baby as a foreign invader, producing antibodies that attack the child's blood cells. For thousands of years before anyone understood why, this silent biological conflict ended countless pregnancies in ways families never had an explanation for. It was only in the 20th century that doctors finally identified the mechanism and developed a way to intervene. If you are type O positive, you carry the far more common and considerably safer version of this equation. But understanding why the plus sign even exists forces you to confront an uncomfortable truth. Even the punctuation mark attached to your blood type carries its own quiet history of loss. There's also a darker chapter buried inside the 20th century itself, one written not by ancient plagues, but by the largest coordinated human catastrophe in modern history. During the First and Second World Wars, military, medical units on every side of the conflict discovered, almost by accident, that soldiers with type O blood were being relied upon constantly as universal donors. Their blood rushed from one wounded man to the next on the battlefield with minimal screening, simply because it was compatible with almost everyone. Music type O soldiers effectively became walking blood banks, their veins tapped again and again to save the lives of strangers wearing the same uniform. Military medical records from field hospitals during those wars show a stark, uncomfortable pattern. Type O blood was drawn more frequently, transfused more urgently, and depended upon more heavily than any other type on Earth, precisely because of the same ancient molecular simplicity that once helped your ancestors dodge malaria in the jungles of ancient Asia. The very trait that helped your bloodline survive for tens of thousands of years quietly turned an entire generation of type O soldiers into the emergency backbone of modern battlefield medicine, whether they ever understood why or not. So by now, a very different picture starts forming. Type O positive blood is not simply an ancient survival badge. It is a complicated, double-edged inheritance, a set of ancient trade-offs your ancestors made under duress, encoded permanently into your biology, whether you ever consented to that trade or not. But just when scientists thought they had finally mapped out the complete story of type O, an entirely separate mystery emerged, one that revealed the dark secret goes even deeper than anyone originally suspected. Music. In 1952, a patient was admitted to a hospital in the city of Bombay, now known as Mumbai. The patient urgently needed a blood transfusion and was tested using standard clinical methods. The results came back type O. Doctors administered ordinary type O blood, following completely standard medical protocol, and the patient's body violently, catastrophically rejected it. The medical staff was stunned. By every conventional measure, this should have been a perfectly safe transfusion. Type O blood is famously known as the universal donor type, safe for almost anyone. So how could a type O patient reject type O blood? When researchers dug deeper into the underlying genetics, they discovered something that quietly rewrote the rules. Think of the entire blood type system like constructing a house. Type A and type B blood represent decorated roofs, built on top of a shared foundation. Type O blood is that foundation itself, a basic molecular structure called the H antigen. But this particular patient in Bombay didn't have the founder, Tian, at all. There was no H antigen present whatsoever. Under a standard blood test, this condition appears completely identical to ordinary type O blood because there is no A or B roof visible on top. But underneath, structurally, it is an entirely different, exceptionally rare biological configuration. This condition became known as the Bombay phenotype, and it functions almost like a genetic disguise, a secret hidden inside a secret. Music. People with the Bombay phenotype can only ever safely receive blood from other Bombay phenotype donors, a genetic group so rare that in most of the world it appears in roughly 1 out of every 1 million people. But in the Indian subcontinent, for reasons still not completely understood, it shows up far more frequently in roughly 1 out of every 10,000 people. The Bombay phenotype stands as a permanent reminder that even within a blood type as globally common as type O, there are hidden regional variants, ancient localized secrets written deep into specific populations, quiet enough that standard modern medical testing doesn't even have the vocabulary to detect them without deeper investigation. Now zoom out, far beyond hospitals and laboratories, and look at the true scale of this ancient story. Around 5,000 years ago, long after the frozen land bridges connecting continents had melted away and vanished beneath rising oceans, a group of seafarers originating from what is now Taiwan looked out across the vast, terrifying expanse of the Pacific Ocean and made an extraordinary decision. They would conquer it, using nothing but hand-built outrigger, canoes, celestial navigation, and an almost unimaginable amount of courage. They began a slow, deliberate expansion across the largest body of open water on the entire planet. Music. They discovered Hawaii. They found New Zealand. They reached the impossibly remote shores of Easter Island. And everywhere these Polynesian voyagers eventually settled, modern DNA testing reveals the exact same striking pattern, an unmistakable spike in ancient type O blood. Consider the sheer improbability of this. 2 of the most isolated human populations to ever exist on planet Earth, the indigenous peoples of the Americas and the Polynesian voyagers scattered across the deep Pacific, separated from one another by thousands of miles of open ocean and thousands of years of independent history, both carry the exact same ancient Asian blood signature. The ocean never washed that inheritance away. It carried it, silently, faithfully, across an entire hemisphere. Thousands of miles away, on a completely different continent, an entirely separate chapter of this same blood signature was quietly unfolding. Genetic surveys of coastal populations in Iceland, Ireland, and parts of Scotland, regions repeatedly raided and settled by Norse seafarers more than 1,000 years ago, reveal type O concentrations noticeably higher than the surrounding mainland European populations they descended from. Music. Historians and geneticists studying Viking-era expansion have proposed that the same brutal maritime lifestyle that shaped Polynesian voyagers, long ocean journeys, limited food supplies, exposure to unfamiliar diseases in newly raided or settled territories, may have quietly favored the survival of crews already carrying the older, hardier type O blueprint. It is a striking pattern. On opposite sides of the planet, separated by thousands of years and zero direct contact, 2 completely unrelated seafaring cultures independently ended up leaning on the exact same ancient genetic advantage simply to survive the ocean itself. But here is where the story turns, once again, into something considerably darker. Because scientists studying these isolated Polynesian and indigenous American populations began noticing another pattern layered on top of the blood type data, a pattern involving disease vulnerability in the modern era. Populations that spent thousands of years genetically isolated, carrying an extremely narrow range of blood types dominated almost entirely by type O, developed something researchers all reduced immunological diversity. In simple terms, when your entire community shares nearly identical blood chemistry, generation after generation, your collective immune system becomes dangerously predictable to any new pathogen that manages to slip through. This is a documented factor behind the catastrophic, devastating impact that European diseases had on indigenous American and Pacific Island populations following first contact. Smallpox, measles, and influenza tore through these communities with horrifying speed and lethality, partly because centuries of genetic isolation, concentrated overwhelmingly around type O blood, had left populations with a dangerously narrow immunological toolkit for confronting entirely unfamiliar invaders. Music. The very same founder effect that once protected these communities from malaria and stomach viruses, thousands of years earlier, in a completely different environment, helped set the stage for one of the deadliest waves of disease mortality in recorded human history. That is the true dark secret hiding inside type O positive blood. It was never simply a story of survival, it is a story of trade-offs, stacked on top of trade-offs, Protection in one century quietly becoming vulnerability in another, spread across an almost incomprehensible span of time and geography. And the story does not end in the ancient past. It is still actively unfolding right now inside modern medical research. In recent years, large-scale studies examining severe viral respiratory infections have repeatedly found statistically significant differences in outcomes tied directly to blood type, with several major studies suggesting that people carrying type O blood may face a somewhat lower relative risk of certain severe viral complications compared to people with type A blood, though researchers caution the underlying biological mechanism is still being actively investigated and is far from fully understood. Music. Other ongoing research continues examining potential links between blood type and pregnancy complications, blood type and certain autoimmune conditions, and blood type and long-term cardiovascular outcomes. Some researchers have even started examining a much stranger question, one that sounds almost like science fiction. Does your blood type quietly influence which pathogens are even capable of evolving in the first place? A handful of laboratory studies have suggested that certain viruses and bacteria, over enough generations of circulating through human populations, may actually adapt more efficiently to whichever blood type happens to be most common in the environment they are spreading through. If that theory continues to hold up under further testing, it would mean something remarkable. Your blood type is not simply a passive target sitting quietly in the crossfire of evolution. It may be an active participant quietly shaping the future evolutionary path of the very diseases trying to infect it, generation after generation, in a slow, invisible arms race that never actually ends. Music. The full picture is nowhere close to finished. Scientists are, quite literally, still in the process of translating a genetic language written tens of thousands of years ago, one clinical study at a time, and every new discovery seems to reveal another layer of complexity nobody had anticipated. So what does all of this actually mean for you, sitting here today, looking at a small printed label on a medical chart that simply reads O positive? It means you're not looking at a random chemical category. You are looking at the surviving fragment of an ancient, brutal negotiation. Somewhere in the deep, distant past, your ancestors walked through disease-choked river valleys, crossed frozen, wind-scoured steppes, and pushed through dense, humid jungles crawling with invisible killers. They stood face to face with plagues, fevers, and parasites capable of wiping out entire bloodlines in a single terrible season. Some of them survived malaria because their blood cells simply refused to clump together. Others did not survive cholera because that exact same blood chemistry left them catastrophically vulnerable. Some crossed frozen land bridges into an empty, unknown continent. Others built canoes and rowed directly into the largest ocean on Earth, trusting nothing but stars and instinct. And every single one of them, whether they realized it or not, was quietly negotiating a permanent contract, written not in ink, but in DNA, a contract that traded protection against one killer for vulnerability against another, over and over again, for thousands of consecutive generations. Music. That contract did not expire when your ancestors finally settled down, built cities, and started keeping written records. It did not expire when modern medicine arrived. It is still active today, quietly running in the background of your biology every single day, shaping your risk of ulcers, your clotting, speed in a medical emergency, your appeal to mosquitoes on a warm summer evening, and possibly even your outcomes during viral outbreaks that your ancestors could never have imagined. You inherited both sides of that ancient bargain. The protection and the price, bundled together, inseparable, passed down silently through unbroken generations until it finally reached you. Your veins are not simply carrying blood. They are carrying the oldest, most honest history book ever written, a book with no author, no editor, and no way to lie about what actually happened. Every clotting protein, every molecular structure missing from the surface of your red blood cells, every quiet statistical pattern buried inside decades of clinical research is a page torn directly out of a survival story spanning tens of thousands of years and thousands of miles. Science has only just begun learning how to properly read those pages, and now, for the first time, so have you. Think about what that actually means the next time you sit in a waiting room, watching a nurse label a small vial with two simple characters. O positive. It is easy to see that label and think of it as clinical, cold, bureaucratic, nothing more than a box to check before a procedure can safely continue. But underneath that label is a story that stretches back through frozen land bridges, across the largest ocean on Earth, through cholera-ravaged river deltas, malaria-choked jungles, and battlefield hospitals soaked in urgency. It is a story your own body has been quietly telling for tens of thousands of years, long before you were ever born. And it will keep being told, generation after generation, long after you're gone, carried forward in the veins of children and grandchildren who may never once think to ask where their blood actually came from. Music. You are simply the current chapter, The most recent name written into a manuscript that started being drafted before agriculture existed, before cities were built, before anyone had invented a written word to describe any of it. If this journey into the hidden, complicated truth behind type O, positive blood, changed the way you look at yourself, I want to hear from you. Music. Drop into the comments right now and tell me your blood type, and if you know it, tell me where in the world your family originally comes from. Thank you for being here, and thank you for exploring the dark, ancient secret quietly written into your blood. Stay curious, and I will see you in the next one.